All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational network, and we try to look into great theories of everything, ancient and modern, usually pretty obscure. A lot of times people who spent their whole life working on something in obscurity and were never really recognized for their contributions. They laid it on the line and got punished as a result of, striving for truth. And they hit a home run with their work, but nobody knows about it. And in my research, I've encountered many of these people, in my opinion. These people are my heroes, and I'm going to try to share their work with you. Many times the work is daunting. It is impenetrable at times. Sometimes when you're trying to articulate something that hasn't been articulated before, it's a little bit difficult to, find the right language. You have to kind of invent words a lot of times. And, it requires, a good deal of deference from the reader and a good deal of dedication from the reader, because sometimes these works are not the easiest to get into. So I try to, help you out a little bit by just going through it on the videos and clarifying things that you might not know. And I'm not exactly sure if I'm helping or hurting with all my editorial comments. I try not to make too many, but I have to do a lot of explaining background information and stuff like that. But today is our 221st video that we've done on the unit that is called the Reciprocal Church, which is a shout out to Dewey B. Larson and his reciprocal system of theory, which was really the first grand unified theory to, use equations and simple concepts to connect science and religion, and to really connect all sciences. So really to unify all of our, educational curriculum. And we've been trying to amass different spiritual resources that one can use in their own life. Things that you can believe in because they have equations, or because they are rational, because they have provided results, and they verify themselves. And these things are needed, I believe, because of our Western religions and their impending doom. They're about to fall apart because of their fraudulence, in particular for the New Testament. The Old Testament is also fraudulent in terms of plagiarism, and in terms of really just the hijacking of any type of God with a capital G by a bunch of gods with small g's. But with the New Testament, we have found that the New Testament is entirely a Roman psyop. It was written by the Romans, the Caesars, in particular Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. They're called the Flavian emperors from 69 to 96 AD. Now, I don't necessarily think that it was written by them personally, but somebody in their court, somebody in their circle, under their auspices. And we're looking at the work right now of Michael Menesgotz, Menasgotz, who has a recently published book called Christianity's Origins, a Flavian secrecy cult. and he's got some work online also. But Metascotts actually takes the works of Josephus, who was the kind of the court historian of the Romans at that time during Vespasian and Titus's rule. Now, I don't necessarily believe that Josephus actually existed. I believe that that was a pen name, but regardless, Josephus wrote Wars of the Jews, or the Jewish War, about the Jewish war between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. And the general for that war was Vespasian until he became the new emperor in 69 AD, and he was replaced by his son Titus as the new general. Titus eventually became emperor as well in 79 AD when his father Vespasian died. Titus only lived for another 2 years and then was succeeded by his brother Domitian in 81 AD. And they had the motive, the means, and the method, and the opportunity to do all of this. They wanted to subdue the Jews. The Jews were a thorn in the side of the Roman Empire for over 100 years. Constant insurrections, revolutions, and even wars. The Jews had very unique belief systems that left them at odds with the Roman attempt to assimilate them. And so they had, their monotheism, and they had their, their kosher cleanliness ritual, strictures. They had their, graven images thing. They had their circumcision. And they had their chosen people thing. And so many of the Jews would rather die than go under the yoke of the Romans, and so that's what they did. Vespasian and Titus killed about 1 million of them in the Jewish war, but they were also injured themselves, and I believe had a hatred that they grew to have against the Jews, or at least the zealous Jews. Now, Jews like so-called Josephus, who was supposed to have been a Jew, I don't believe was, but in his autobiography, he talks about how he was one of the Jewish generals in this war, and was captured by Vespasian and eventually defected, and predicted his ascension to the throne, and as a result was pardoned by Vespasian and brought to Rome as the court historian, and adopted into the Flavian family. But anyway, Metascotts, this author, uses Josephus's work, War of the Jews, or the Jewish War, and which came out in the 70s AD, 75 or later AD, and the book of Luke from the New Testament. And he shows that these two works were written by the same author at the same time, and are intended to be read simultaneously, as one parodies the other and then parodies itself right back. And he graphs it out by charting using a graph that was kind of just coming into knowledge then at this time in the first century, maybe a century before that. They did start graphing these things out, and he put the book of Luke on the vertical axis and the book of the Jewish War on the horizontal axis. And then he took all the spots that are parallels between one and the other, and he plotted all the points. Just in the book of Luke, he finds about 250 parallels with Wars of the Jews. And when putting all these together, they spell a 5-letter word in Latin, or a five letters in Latin, APTVS, which I believe stands for Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus. Arius Piso being one of the noblemen who kind of is behind the scenes and was said to have been kind of a shadow emperor or co-emperor with both Vespasian and Titus, but also went by the pseudonym of Josephus, according to Abelard Rushlin and Roman Piso. And then Titus Vespasianus, as Titus and Vespasian, they used that same imprint on coins that they had minted at this time. So the TVS part is on pretty solid ground. The AP part could also mean a few other things that Menescott talks about. But his basic thesis is that the Gospels and the War of the Jews was designed in order to first get people into the Jesus cult or the Jesus religion, but then to kind of pull that away, because what you see in these parallels is you see that in many cases Jesus predicts something that's going to happen or prophesies something that's going to happen, and then that thing is fulfilled by Titus or Vespasian in the Wars of the Jews. So basically Titus is the second coming of Jesus, if you read them together. And so when that is revealed, it's hard to see it. Many of these, they're riddles and it's hidden very clever. This is a very high-level piece of propaganda. They must have taken them forever to put this together. But yes, so the parallels are a little bit hard to see. Once you see them, you can't really unsee them. And they're intended so that eventually you kind of have to pull away from, you recognize that the Jesus part is a fiction, and that you begin to worship Titus and Vespasian as the emperors, or as gods. So that's kind of the general idea. He calls it like a Mithraism type secrecy cult, where you kind of get initiated step by step into finally. And so that's, I don't really like the thesis. I don't think he really needs the thesis, because the work itself is so explosive that it kind of, by continuing to harp on the thesis, it kind of is distracting from the work. But we're going to start right here, because maybe he will prove me wrong. In coming chapters, I will dig into the detail of these parallels and show that some of them contain riddles, which, when the solutions are presented, would assist in directing believers to accept Titus as the divine second coming. I'll come back to why Jesus sometimes parallels Vespasian, but first I'll explain how the final revelation would have worked. So he's trying to explain this secrecy cult, and I'm just changing pages here, or turning pages, which has been kind of a bane of my existence since I've started doing this book here. Okay, so this is called Revelation 2, showing that both documents parody each other. Okay, this is what I was talking about before. So not only is Jesus, the New Testament, a fiction, but Wars of the Jews is also a fiction. So Revelation 2 showing that both documents parody each other, and therefore the Romans made Jesus' story up, plus the APTVS message showing that they are all intentional, therefore conversion to pure Flavian emperor worship. I don't get that. It's still, I think there's still another step. You have to recognize that the Wars of the Jews, even though it's supposed to be a history, and it's really our only history from the 1st century that survives until the Dead Sea Scrolls really were discovered. That's a fiction too. Josephus is obviously made up as well. Or, you know, probably the events occurred. I mean, the war definitely occurred. But his, you know, explanation of the details is filled with, you know, passages that are intended to create parallels. Okay, my research builds on Joseph Atwill's discoveries from his book Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and was a 4-year effort cataloging the parallels between Luke and the Jewish War. These are plotted below. You can see that in the thumbnail for this video. And you can see there are far more parallels than what Atwill described. My research revealed that the parallels in Luke and Jewish War involve both documents parodying each other, with the parallels arranged to form a complex and clearly intentional pattern. When plotted, they form 5 Latin letters, APTVS. I have shown the ones where Luke is parodying Jewish War in blue and the rest in black. And so, you know, there's a mixture of the two. Most of them are in black. Most of them are where the Jewish War is parodying Luke. But most of the ones that Joseph Atwill found and the ones that are on that diagonal line on the V, that, you know, they're all in order. You know, as you move through the narrative in the gospel, in the book of Luke, you also move through the narrative in Jewish War. Those are in blue. So those are Luke parodying Jewish War. But really all of the ones from the AP and the T are in black. Jewish War parodying Luke. So if the Jewish War is parodying Luke, you know, that could mean that the Jewish War was written after Luke, which is kind of what people, you know, who want to dismiss this theory would be able to say, oh, well, yeah, the Jewish War is parodying Luke because Luke comes later. But then when you have the blue dots where Luke is parodying Jewish War, that becomes problematic for the ability to debunk this. You know, when they parody each other, then you're almost forced into thinking that they were written by the same person at the same time. Same people, anyway. Since it isn't possible to parody a story until that story actually exists, if the core narratives of 2 stories intimately parody each other, this can only mean they were created together. Or put differently, if you create a parody of a story that already exists, we can be certain that this pre-existing story will not, indeed cannot, be a parody of your parody. The upshot is that to make 2 stories deeply parody each other requires editorial control over both of them. As will be shown later, all of these parodies are carefully hidden, using subtle metaphors spread out in the text to ensure nobody would realize, yet allowing the author to reveal it whenever they chose to, in order to prove that Luke has the same origin as Jewish War. This origin is undeniably, and in Jewish war is indeed explicitly, the government of Vespasian and Titus, the Roman emperors. I realize my reader will ask why the word APTVS was chosen. Apparently that is a word as well, the Latin word for apt or fitting. In brief, the TVS in APTVS either relates to the initials of Titus, whilst the AP and the religious significance of APTVS as a whole are two entire topics to themselves, which I will come back to later. Yeah, well, I'm trying to remember where I saw the coin that has the TVS imprint on it. I'm going to have to look for that because I don't know that he brings it up here. Anyway, switching to the next page. Okay, now this, hopefully this is the correct page. Make sure. This is not user friendly. Okay. And I'm not a friendly user either. Oh. Okay, the explanatory power of my thesis. Occam's razor suggests that the theory requiring the fewest assumptions is preferred, although it assumes you have two complete explanations that have the same explanatory power, and also that the explanations are in fact complete. But more modern texts have a greater emphasis on testability or reproducibility. Perhaps a better razor is that the preferred theory is the one that has the greatest explanatory power, can be tested, and which requires the fewest assumptions and has the fewest gaps in the explanation itself. Of these factors, I think most scientists would agree that explanatory power is king, so let's start there. My thesis can explain all of the following, whilst neither the Christian nor mythicist viewpoints can explain any of them. He's got a list of 15 items right here. 1. Why Jesus' story evokes that of earlier deity myths, including Samson, Hercules, and Mithras. 2. Why the Gospels offer differing layouts, content, and detail, yet in so many places have identical wording. 3. Why Jewish war has references to Jesus' story, which have the appearance of being inserted. Now remember, Josephus' Jewish war is really the only work from the first century, that secular work from the first century that corroborates the existence of Jesus, that mentions Jesus. Actually, that's not even true. It's not in Jewish war. It's in a later work from Josephus called Jewish Antiquities that came out in the 90s. So he's making a mistake there, just like the mistake that I just made. But that is not actually in Jewish war. The Testimonium is in a later work, Jewish Antiquities. He writes the entire 7 books of the Jewish war without referring to Jesus' story at all. As far as I can tell, he does refer to the killing of Jesus' brother James. And he has like 6 or 7 characters in Jewish war who are named Jesus. And every one of them is kind of like a parody or a mockery of the Jesus from the New Testament, including the woe-saying Jesus who is kind of like a crazy guy who comes into at Passover, 73 A.D. or whatever, or maybe 70 A.D. when the temple is being destroyed, and he says, "Woe to this! Woe to that! Woe to this!" If you look in Luke, that's the same thing. The same thing that Jesus says in, I don't remember what chapter of Luke that's in, but he says, "Woe to you and woe to this." Finally, the Jesus character in Josephus says, "And woe to myself." And at that very moment, a projectile from the Romans, they used to have these giant slingshots, I think, that flung these huge boulders over the temple walls into the courtyard or whatever, and he was annihilated by one of these giant boulders. And right after he says, "Woe to me," he says, "Woe to this, woe to that, woe to this," and then he says, "Woe to me," and then he's dead. So if you believe that, then you'll believe anything, and that's what we're at, where we're at here with the Christian story. So number 3 is questionable why Jewish war has references to Jesus' story, which have the appearance of being inserted. That is not in Jewish war. Okay, number 4. I could be mistaken, but I don't believe it is. Number 4, why early Christian symbols are found disproportionately in Roman military sites. 5, why the Gospels were created and who they were written for. 6, why the Gospels originate from the fall of Jerusalem. That is, in the 70s, or after 70 AD, or really 68, 69 AD. Why Jesus' second coming was promised, and why it was never revealed. Number 8, why the Gospels allude to containing hidden meaning, and why this was never revealed. Number 9, why Jesus had a hidden, transfigured, and white appearance. Because he was a Roman. Number 10, why Jesus tells Roman soldiers to accept low pay or selects a Roman centurion slave to heal. Number 11, that doesn't seem to be that explanatory, but why wouldn't he select a Roman centurion slave to heal? Why God is presented as a trio, why the New Testament books John and Acts contain triangle numbers, and who the Holy Ghost represents. Number 12, why the early church was so paranoid, limiting independent writing and only offering the Bible in Latin. Number 13, why Constantine called the Council of Nicaea not to decide the canon, but to suppress a blasphemy of Arius. Not aware of that. Number 14, why huge efforts were made to promote the idea that the Romans persecuted Christians. And that a lot of that research that refutes that idea has been done by Candida Moss, and her, I can't remember the name of her book, but she is the professor that's written the book kind of debunking or, indicating how the persecution of Christians by Romans has been heavily exaggerated, and that most of the so-called persecution of Christians by Romans was actually persecution of Jews by Romans. Jews like James, the brother of Jesus, who was a Jew, but was kind of, there is a kind of a perforated line there between the Jews and the Romans here. I mean, between the Jews and the Christians here at this time, because many of them were Jews, but many of them were leaning toward becoming Christians. Not James. James was pretty much, believed that his brother was, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls anyway, that his brother was a human, and this was all part of, genetic line of Jewish kings, not about divinity. And so most of the Christians, most of the so-called Christians, were actually Jews, and same with the gladiators and stuff like that. They say Christians versus lions. It was Jews versus lions. And the Jews also, the plunder of the temple is what paid for the Roman Colosseum. And the Colosseum was built by Jewish slaves, prisoners of war from the Jewish war. And the participants in the gladiator matches were also the Jews. So they took the brunt of the whole thing, but the Christians are kind of getting the, the credit, or whatever, whatever you want to call it, the, in the victim Olympics, so-called. Okay, number 14, why the original sources for the Essene are all linked to the Flavian emperors, and why these sources describe that the Essenes did not sacrifice animals and only had one foodstuff in each meal. And indeed, I could list many more things that my discoveries and thesis explain, and I will do so at the end of the book. Okay, we're a long way from that, but the next section is called The Number and Size of Assumptions Required and the Gaps Required to be Filled. We'll get into that section tomorrow when we return. And this book is getting started pretty slowly. He's stated his thesis like 3 or 4 times. Hasn't really gotten going, but I believe he will. The presentation may not be there, but the information is really great. So thanks for tuning in today.